is salty. The Volga flows into the Caspian Sea. All animals are afraid of fire. It's silly, but these very truisms popped into my head as I fumbled for a lighter in the pocket of my windbreaker. Imagine a dim tunnel, a growling predator below, gleaming rails, and me pinned to the ceiling by cables, pondering philosophical questions. Not exactly philosophical. It's not true. Not all animals are afraid of fire, but all animals are afraid of the pain of fire. The light from the lantern didn't frighten the badger, although it might have thrown him off balance. Animals, like humans, like any living creature, are afraid of pain. Here's my chance. At first, I almost ruined everything. It occurred to me to create a fire and then, crushing the plastic lighter cartridge, unleash a cascade of flames on the monster. If I had done so, I would undoubtedly have instantly burst into flames myself and, howling in pain, leaped straight into the mouth of the badger, who was yearning for a hot meal. But my guardian angel was somewhere nearby, and after some thought, I abandoned this absurd idea. Pulling the ribbon holding the hood of my windbreaker from the collar, I tied it in a knot on one of the cables and, turning the lighter wheel, carefully ignited it from below. The badger watched my actions warily, and, when the flame flared up, he slightly recoiled, hiding his muzzle. Apparently, the light was causing him some discomfort after all. The tiny flame at the end of my makeshift tinder didn't go out, and I began the second part of my plan. Undressing under the ceiling was incredibly uncomfortable, but there was nothing else to do. I hung my windbreaker and sweater side by side on the power line to dry. I tore my t-shirt with my teeth, ripped it in two, then, pulling my belt out of my jeans, tucked one of the pieces of the former t-shirt into the buckle and tied it in a knot. Then I pulled the sweater back on, wrapped my windbreaker around my left arm, and, settling myself more securely, carefully crushed the lighter canister, making sure the contents spilled onto both pieces of the t-shirt. I knew the liquid would evaporate instantly, so I had no time to hesitate. I quickly brought one of the pieces to the tinder. The fabric immediately ignited, though not as brightly as I expected, and I threw it down. I was lucky that the beast buried its head in its paws during the flash and didn't see the flaming fabric swooping down on it. There was a deafening shriek and a sharp smell of burning, but I wasn't looking down anymore. The belt with the rag tied around my right wrist served as a torch, and as soon as the flames flared, I freed myself from the cables and plummeted from the second floor, landing rather fortunately on my side without breaking anything. Time stretched out. Hearing somewhere ahead the furious growl of a beast maddened by pain, I rose terribly slowly and still could not get up completely, and straightening up, I discovered with horror that my torch had almost gone out during the fall, and the wheezing badger was already turning its muzzle towards me, and its fury could at any moment turn into a furious attack. But I, intoxicated by some feverish premonition of a fight, inherited from my distant ancestors, let out a wild cry and rushed at the enemy, and his fury turned into fear, which I felt with my whole body, and instead of sinking his teeth into my throat, he rushed to flee, and I rushed after him, waving the belt, and my torch flared brightly, and I still managed to reach his pale, bouncing backside with my fiery sword, and he squealed wildly, like a rat caught in a mousetrap. The beast darted even faster, spreading the smell of fear and scorched fur, and I kept chasing after it, screaming at the top of my lungs and swinging the belt. At the station, the beast leaped onto the platform, dashed past the two nearest pylons, and in the flickering light of my torch, I was astonished to see it, as if flattened, squeezed through a narrow space, no more than 30 centimeters wide, under a bench standing against the inner wall. The torch burned out, and I dropped the belt onto the tracks. Then I sat down, leaning my back against the contact rail. There was neither joy nor fear. The emotional and physical surge had given way to complete collapse and indifference. I couldn't care less. If the badger had come back and started nibbling on me, it wouldn't have interested me in the slightest. Then I somehow pulled myself together, went to get the still burning lantern, trying briefly, but failing, horrified by the thought of what would happen if it broke, and then, completely unexpectedly, decided to go see where the badger had gone. Overcoming the terrible aches throughout my body, I struggled up the metal steps to the platform and hobbled into the hall. The 7 figures were still standing in their niches, and shining the flashlight around, I was somewhat relieved to see that there was no 8th figure in sight. I don't remember if I mentioned that each station had 4 benches, located along the wall opposite the platform. They blended into the station landscape in different ways, but there were always 4 of them. So that's it. It was under the second bench from the right that my recent friend had disappeared. Bending over, I couldn't see anything at first, and for a moment, I even doubted that this was where it happened. The gap under the bench was so narrow that even I would have had trouble squeezing through. But then I remembered how a classmate of mine, now a biology and geography teacher, once told me that rodents like mice and rats have skull bones, their most oversized part, designed in such a way that when the animal squeezes into a narrow space, they fold over each other. Perhaps this creature also has such flexible bones. I lay down on the marble floor next to the bench, turned off the flashlight, and closed my eyes for a few seconds to better adjust to the darkness. Then I moved the flashlight forward so the blazing light wouldn't blind me, and turned it on. I expected to see a dark, winding burrow leading off into the depths, perhaps the predatory face of its denizens. But what I saw was completely unexpected. Behind a concrete wall about a foot thick, I saw a tunnel, just like any other tunnel connecting the Snezhinsk metro stations. Just like, but not quite. The tunnel had 2 tracks, noticeably narrower than usual. On both narrow gauge tracks, there were scores of low, dirt-filled cars disappearing into the darkness. Not a single cable ran along the tunnel walls. There was something else unusual about this tunnel, but I couldn't figure out what exactly, and I didn't really try. That's it. I couldn't see anything else. I won't lie. After lying on my stomach for about 3 minutes, I got up and walked away without any interest. Another tunnel, I thought listlessly. Well, to hell with it. Perhaps you won't understand me. How can this be, you'll say? In a secret subway, and the secret tunnel at that. How could I not be surprised? How could I have paid so little attention to it? But try to understand me. All my senses were dulled, a typical defensive reaction. I'd just been nearly eaten by a beast unknown to science. I'd miraculously escaped, and you expect me to be surprised, to ponder, or worse yet, to cling to its jaws again. However, something was going on in my brain, and I was sure the results of this work would surface sooner or later. For now, I leisurely pulled on my windbreaker and, hanging the lantern around my neck, descended back onto the tracks. After some thought, I decided not to go back for my duffel bag. It's still lying somewhere there, not far from the sorting station. I picked up my belt and slowly wandered toward Kurchatovskaya. For some reason, I no longer feared pursuit. I'd like to end my story about that incident with a small, seemingly insignificant episode. After I'd already passed Uralskaya, my belt buckle, which I'd been mindlessly swinging from side to side, brushed against the tunnel wall, unexpectedly striking a bright spark. I mechanically scratched a fresh scratch in the whitewash with my fingernail and leisurely continued on. Then I stopped and scratched the wall again. Then I scratched the wall in another place. I'd really like to lie and say that at that moment I understood everything. That would be very elegant, but I'd be lying. At that moment, I simply wasn't in a position to draw any sweeping conclusions, but metaphorically likening thought to a subway train, I can say that it was then that my train entered the only possible tunnel leading to my destination. Although, if you ask me what I was thinking about as I hobbled through the dark corridors of the underground, climbed the steps of the Kurchatovskaya escalator tunnel, and squeezed through the still narrow opening of the broken tunnel, my words will surprise you, and you'll think they have nothing to do with this whole story. But you'd be wrong. Should I tell you what I was thinking about? I was thinking about tubing.